I never thought a patch of grass could turn me into the kind of person who spent an entire weekend planning revenge. Not loud revenge. Not the kind that ends with police reports or screaming matches in the street. The quiet kind. The kind that waits patiently and lets people walk straight into the consequences of their own choices. My name is Ethan Walker, and a couple years ago, I bought a corner lot house in a small town called Millbrook Ridge. You know the type of place. Kids ride bikes until the streetlights come on. People wave when they pass each other. Every mailbox looks suspiciously well-maintained. The kind of town where everyone acts friendly, but somehow still keeps score of whose lawn looks best. When I bought that house, the thing I loved most wasn't the kitchen or the garage. It was the yard. The property sat right where Hawthorne Drive met Maple Street, and because of the corner lot, I had this wide stretch of green wrapping around the side of the house. Every Saturday morning, I'd be out there mowing, edging, watering. It wasn't about impressing anybody. I just liked taking care of something. There's a strange satisfaction in looking at a yard and knowing every inch of it exists because you put in the work. For the first 6 months, life was pretty much perfect. Then one Tuesday morning, I stepped outside with a cup of coffee and noticed tire marks. Nothing major. Just 2 curved lines pressed into the grass near the curb. I stared at them for a second. That was about all the attention I gave it. Somebody probably turned too wide. It happens. The next morning there were more. A few days later there were even more. By the second week, I realized something wasn't adding up. This wasn't random. This was routine. Every weekday morning around 8:15, traffic would start backing up at the light on Hawthorne. It wasn't a terrible intersection, but it was just annoying enough to tempt impatient people. And apparently someone had discovered a shortcut. My yard. The first time I actually saw it happen, I almost laughed because it was so ridiculous. A silver sedan rolled up to the corner, slowed down, checked for traffic, and then casually drove across my grass. Not accidentally. Not because they lost control. They just chose to. Like my property was a public access road nobody had bothered to pave yet. The car bounced slightly over the lawn before cutting across the corner and merging back onto Maple Street ahead of everyone waiting at the light. 30 seconds later, another car did the exact same thing. Then another. I stood there by the living room window holding my coffee, watching complete strangers redesign my property in real time. The worst part wasn't the damage. It was the confidence. Nobody hesitated. Nobody looked guilty. Nobody even looked around. They acted like they belonged there. A few days later, I mentioned it to my neighbor, Walter Briggs. Walter was retired military, 70 years old, the kind of guy who sharpened his lawnmower blades twice a season and somehow managed to make hedge trimming look like a tactical operation. You ever notice people cutting through my yard? I asked. Walter didn't even stop trimming. Yep, that was it. Just yep. I remember staring at him. That's all you got. He shrugged. People will take whatever shortcut you leave open. I laughed. That's a pretty cynical way to look at it. Walter finally looked over at me. No, he said. It's a realistic way to look at it. I didn't realize at the time, but that sentence would stick in my head for months. People will take whatever shortcut you leave open. Because that's exactly what happened. The more people used it, the worse it got. The grass flattened. Then the dirt started showing. Then a visible path appeared. It looked like somebody had taken a giant eraser and wiped away part of my lawn. One Saturday morning, I spent 3 hours repairing the damaged area. New seed, fresh soil, extra watering. By Monday, it looked decent again. By Wednesday, it looked like a racetrack. That was the moment I stopped seeing it as lawn damage. Because it wasn't really about grass anymore. It was about something else. Something harder to explain. Every time a car crossed that corner, it felt like someone was saying your property doesn't matter. Your effort doesn't matter. Your boundaries don't matter. And once that feeling settled into my head, I couldn't stop noticing it. Then one morning, I finally decided to confront someone. Looking back now, that's probably when this whole thing truly began. Looking back now, that's probably when this whole thing truly began. It happened on a Thursday morning. I had gotten up earlier than usual, mostly because I was tired of watching the same thing happen from behind a window. Around 8:10, I walked out to the edge of the yard and stood near the corner where the tire tracks were deepest. I didn't have a plan. I wasn't looking for a fight. I just wanted somebody to acknowledge that what they were doing was wrong. A few minutes later, a black SUV approached the intersection. I recognized it immediately. I'd seen that vehicle cut across my lawn at least a dozen times. The driver slowed down, preparing to make his usual shortcut, and I raised my hand. Not aggressively, just enough to get his attention. He rolled down his window halfway. "Morning," I said. He looked annoyed already. "Yeah, this is private property." For a second, I thought maybe that would be enough. Maybe he'd apologize. Maybe he'd realize somebody actually lived here. Instead, he looked from me to the grass and back again. Then he smirked. Actually smirked. "Relax," he said. "It's just grass." Then he drove across anyway, right in front of me, like I wasn't even standing there, like I was some decorative lawn ornament that happened to be talking. I stood there watching his taillights disappear and felt something shift inside me. Not rage. Rage burns hot. This felt colder. Much colder. That evening, I walked the path again. The same path those cars had created. The dirt was packed down so hard it barely felt like soil anymore. Hundreds of tires had passed through there. Maybe thousands. And I kept hearing that guy's voice in my head. It's just grass. Funny thing is, when people say something is just anything, they're usually missing the point. It's just grass. It's just a fence. It's just a parking space. It's just a property line. Except it never is. The object isn't the issue. Respect is. The next weekend, I decided to solve the problem the reasonable way. I drove to a garden center outside town and bought decorative landscaping rocks. Big ones. Not massive, but large enough that any normal person would see them and think, maybe I shouldn't drive here. I spent half a day placing them carefully along the curve. When I finished, the corner actually looked better than before. Cleaner. More intentional. I stood back admiring my work and thought, there. Problem solved. Monday morning proved how wrong I was. The silver sedan showed up first. The driver slowed slightly when they saw the rocks. For one glorious second, I thought common sense had won. Then the front tire nudged the first rock aside. The second tire pushed another one. The driver simply bulldozed through the entire row and continued across my lawn. I actually laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. By Wednesday, half the rocks had been shoved into the dirt, and the rest were scattered near the sidewalk. Apparently, my landscaping had become an obstacle course. So I escalated. Next came wooden posts. Heavy-duty pressure-treated stakes. I drove them deep into the ground and spaced them evenly along the shortcut. Nobody could possibly miss them. The setup looked obvious. Permanent. Definitive. 2 days later, I watched a pickup truck clip one of the posts. The stake snapped like a toothpick. The driver never even stopped. I remember standing at the window with my mouth hanging open. Did that really just happen? Apparently it did. Within a week, several posts were broken. A few had disappeared entirely. One looked like someone had intentionally run it over multiple times. That was when frustration started turning into obsession. Every morning, I'd check the yard before checking my email. Every evening, I'd inspect the damage before eating dinner. The problem had taken up residence in my head, and the more I tried solving it politely, the worse it seemed to get. So I tried signs. Simple signs. Professional signs. Private property. Please stay off the grass. Thank you. I even added the thank you because some ridiculous part of me still thought courtesy might work. It didn't. People drove past them. People drove around them. One guy actually drove over one. The sign ended up face down in the dirt like it had given up before I had. A few weeks later, I ran into Walter again. He was washing his truck in the driveway. I must have looked exhausted because he took one glance at me and started laughing. "You look like a man losing an argument." "I am losing an argument." He nodded toward my yard. "Still happening?" "Worse than ever." I told him about the rocks, the posts, the signs, the conversations, the damage, everything. When I finally finished, Walter leaned against his truck and crossed his arms. "You know what your problem is?" "I've got several." "Be specific." He grinned. "You're trying to convince people." "What does that mean?" "It means you're assuming they care." That hit harder than I wanted to admit, because deep down I knew he was right. The drivers weren't confused. They weren't uninformed. They weren't accidentally trespassing. They understood perfectly. They just didn't care, because nothing happened when they did it. There was no consequence, no cost, no reason to stop. Walter grabbed a towel from the truck bed. Then he said something I wouldn't fully understand until later. Most people don't respect a boundary because it's there. I frowned. What are you talking about? They respect a boundary when crossing it becomes inconvenient. Then he tossed the towel over his shoulder and went back to washing the truck. Conversation over. Just like that. I stood there for another minute staring at my ruined corner lot. Crossing it becomes inconvenient. That sentence followed me home. It followed me through dinner. It followed me while I watched television. It followed me into bed. Around midnight, I got up and walked outside. The neighborhood was quiet. Streetlights glowed softly across the empty roads. The shortcut sat there in front of me like a scar. And for the first time, I stopped thinking about signs. I stopped thinking about warnings. I stopped thinking about asking people to do the right thing. Instead, I started thinking about something else. What if the shortcut simply stopped working? Not through damage, not through punishment, not through confrontation, just resistance. Enough resistance that drivers would decide the road was easier. The idea arrived all at once, then refused to leave. The next morning, I measured the path. That afternoon, I visited a hardware store 3 towns over where nobody knew me. And for the next several days, I quietly gathered materials. Steel, concrete, tools. Nothing illegal, nothing dangerous, but definitely unusual enough that I didn't feel like answering questions about it. By Friday evening, I had everything I needed. Saturday morning, before sunrise, I stepped into the yard with a shovel. The air was cool. The streets were empty. And as I looked down at the worn path cutting across my property, I realized something. For weeks I'd been reacting. Now, for the first time, I was about to take control. And if my plan worked, nobody would ever see it coming. And if my plan worked, nobody would ever see it coming. I started before sunrise that Saturday. The town was still asleep. No traffic, no lone mowers, no barking dogs. Just that quiet suburban silence that only exists for a few hours every weekend. For the next 2 days, I worked almost nonstop. I dug a narrow trench, following the exact curve the shortcut had carved through my yard. Not deep enough to attract attention, not shallow enough to be useless. Every measurement mattered. Then came the reinforcement. Short steel posts, anchored securely beneath the surface, positioned carefully along the route where tires always traveled. The goal wasn't to damage a vehicle. I need to make that clear. I wasn't trying to create a trap. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I simply wanted the ground to stop cooperating. When everything was installed, I filled the trench back in, packed the soil, rolled out fresh sod, watered the entire area, and stepped back. By Sunday evening, the lawn looked perfect, actually better than it had looked in months. Standing there with the garden hose in my hand, even I had trouble seeing where I'd worked, which meant nobody else would notice either. Now all I had to do was wait. Monday morning arrived. 8:12. I stood by the front window with a cup of coffee. The silver sedan appeared right on schedule. Somehow that didn't surprise me. Certain people are as predictable as sunrise. The car approached the intersection, drifted toward the corner, and rolled onto the grass exactly like it had every other morning. Then something beautiful happened. Nothing. No caras. No noise. No dramatic movie moment. The car simply stopped. The driver hesitated. The vehicle rocked slightly. It stopped again. For a few seconds, the driver sat there looking confused. Finally, the sedan backed up, returned to the road, and merged into traffic with everyone else. I remember blinking. "Well," I said quietly. "That's new." A minute later, another vehicle tried. Same result. Then another. And another. By the 4th attempt, something interesting started happening. Drivers were watching each other. People weren't just reacting to the resistance. They were reacting to uncertainty. Nobody knew why the shortcut suddenly felt wrong. They just knew something had changed. By Wednesday morning, the pattern was collapsing. Cars still drifted toward the corner out of habit. Then they'd slow down, pause, think about it, and continue toward the intersection. The shortcut was dying. Not because anybody forced them, because doubt had entered the equation. And once people start questioning a shortcut, they usually abandon it. Within a week, the traffic was gone completely. The corner belonged to my yard again. No signs, no arguments, no confrontations, just silence. The kind of silence that feels earned. Over the next month, the grass recovered beautifully. Fresh green growth filled the damaged areas. The dirt patches disappeared. The scar faded. Eventually, there was no visible evidence that hundreds of cars had ever crossed that lawn. One evening, I was watering the yard when Walter wandered over. He stood there for a minute looking at the corner. Then he looked at me. "Funny thing," he said. "What? Traffic seems to have forgotten your property exists." I smiled. "Seems that way." He nodded slowly. "You didn't build a fence." "Nope." "No new signs." "Nope." Walter studied me for a few seconds. Then the corner. Then me again. Finally, he chuckled. "You figured it out." I laughed. "Maybe." "What did you do?" I shrugged. "Nothing visible." Walter started laughing harder. Not because the answer was funny, because it told him everything he needed to know. "Well," he said, "whatever you did worked." Then he headed home. That was the end of that conversation. No details. No explanations. Just mutual understanding. A few days later, I had one final encounter. The black SUV pulled up along the curb while I was checking the mailbox. The same driver. The same guy who'd looked me in the eye and said, "It's just grass." Only this time, there was no smirk. No attitude. No confidence. He rolled down the window. Hey. He pointed toward the corner. "What happened over there?" I looked at the yard. "What do you mean?" "My SUV wouldn't go through anymore." I nodded thoughtfully. Huh. Sounds frustrating." The guy stared at me, trying to decide whether I was messing with him. Maybe I was. A little. Finally, he shook his head. "Guess I'll wait at the light." Probably the safest option. For a second, I thought he might argue. Instead, he surprised me. He actually laughed. Not a big laugh. Just enough to admit he'd gotten the message. Then he drove away. And that was the last conversation we ever had. Funny thing is, once the problem disappeared, so did most of my anger. I thought I'd feel victorious. I thought I'd replay the whole thing in my head and enjoy every second. Instead, I mostly felt relieved. Because the truth is, the lawn was never the real issue. The issue was the assumption behind it. The belief that someone else's property mattered less than your convenience. The belief that if nobody stopped you, then what you were doing must be acceptable. What I learned from the whole experience is that people rarely test boundaries because they're confused. Most of the time they test them because they're curious how much resistance they'll encounter. And once resistance appears, even quietly, behavior changes remarkably fast. Today the yard looks better than ever. Kids walk past it on their way home from school. Neighbors wave when they drive by. The corner is just a corner again. But every now and then, somebody new approaches that intersection and starts drifting toward the edge of the grass. I can see the thought forming, the temptation, the shortcut. Then they hesitate. They straighten the wheel, and they stay on the road. Every single time, I notice that tiny moment, that choice. And honestly, that's the part one remember most. Not the solution, not the frustration, not even the victory. Just that brief moment when someone decides where the line is. Now here's what I'd love to know from you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have built a fence? Called the police? Install cameras? Taken legal action? Or would you have handled it the same way I did and let the problem solve itself through consequences instead of confrontation? And here's the bigger question. Was I protecting my property, or was I being passive-aggressive? Was it smart, or was it petty? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I've heard arguments from both sides, and honestly, even now, I'm not completely sure where I land. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's ever had a neighbor, stranger, or community member treat their property like it belonged to everyone else. And remember, sometimes the most effective boundary isn't the one people can see. It's the one they finally learn to respect.